I'm Matt McClure, and this is Currents. The tragedy in Japan has a lot of people asking, where was God? We'll look for answers. Plus, after the disaster, miraculous stories of survival. And this time it's not a billboard. A local parish screens a film looking at the effects of abortion on the African American community.
The number of African American babies who are being killed in the abortion clinics is just shattering. 60% of African American babies in New York City are being killed by abortion.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. Could radiation levels at harmful levels spread throughout Japan and beyond? Well, that is what officials fear now after a second fire followed an explosion at Japan's Fukushima nuclear plant. While 200,000 people living nearby have been evacuated, elsewhere others are still struggling to survive the rubble and devastation that the earthquake and tsunami brought. Martin Savage has the latest from Tokyo.
In a rare appearance on Wednesday, Japan's Emperor Akihito told his people not to give up hope as the country deals with the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami and now fears of a nuclear catastrophe.
Currently, the entire nation is putting forth its best effort to save all suffering people. And hopefully with these efforts, we will be able to encourage victims and offer them hope as they try to recover.
Meanwhile, workers returned to the damaged Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant Wednesday after being evacuated for fluctuating radiation levels. There was another fire at the plant's number 4 reactor building on Wednesday morning, and government officials are now concerned about a possible breach in the containment vessel for reactor number 3. The containment vessel insulates radioactive material inside.
At around 8:30 a.m. today, at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, number 3 reactor has been seeing white smoke coming out.
Helicopters from the Japanese Self-Defense Force had to abort an attempt to contain the crisis by dumping water on the damaged reactors to cool them. Analysts say the recent fire brings new cause for concern.
And each time there's one of these fires, the danger to those spent fuel ponds increases that because they're not contained. They're unlike the reactors at 1, 2, and 3. There's no big concrete shielding for them, and if they are compromised, it would be very serious indeed.
Here in Tokyo, the government says there's been no significant rise in radiation levels, but there has been a significant rise in people's fear. All throughout Tokyo, a city of 12 million people, you will find the streets very eerily quiet, traffic extremely light. Many of the shelves in grocery stores have sold out of the basics like bread, milk, and water. And there are long lines of people at Narita Airport trying to get out of the country.
That is correspondent Martin Savage reporting. Now, in the aftermath of the disaster in Japan, and with the possibility that the situation could actually get worse before it gets better, many people are asking, where is God in all of this? Fox News host and radio personality Glenn Beck gave his take recently.
I'm not saying God is, causing earthquakes. Well, no, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that either. God, what God does is God's business. I have no idea. But I'll tell you this, whether you call it Gaia or whether you call it Jesus, there's a message being sent. And that is, hey, you know that stuff we're doing? Not really working out real well. Maybe we should stop doing some of it. I'm just saying.
Well, that is certainly one way to look at the situation, but we wanted a different perspective. Tim Muldoon is a Catholic theologian, writer, and spiritual director. He's also a contributor to the website patheos.com. And in a recent article, he had a completely different take than did Mr. Beck. I had the chance to speak with Tim by phone earlier today. Well, Tim, thanks so much for taking some time out for us here on Currents today. We really appreciate your time, sir.
I'm glad to be with you.
Well, of course, when we look at the situation going on in Japan right now, and all of these pictures that we've been seeing are just horrific, and the situation there is, of course, very dire. Where is God in the middle of all this?
Well, I think the short answer is God is right there. I think a comforting answer is that God is with the people who are suffering. God is trying to comfort them, trying to show them that grace still happens even in the midst of tragedy. That God is not absent. I think that's the primary message, and it's certainly the one that we want to be saying to those that are affected by any tragedy, that they're never alone, that if we believe in a God who is, in fact, God, then we want to find the ways that God is working even in the times of tragedy.
Right. Of course, a lot of people, the more high-profile people who have been saying, who've been exploring that question, where is God in the middle of all this? Some of them, anyway, have come up with sort of the explanation of divine punishment in a way. I mean, of course, we had Glenn Beck, also the governor of the area there around Tokyo, saying, having to apologize, coming out and apologizing for making a statement about the earthquake and tsunami being divine punishment for something. What's your reaction to those statements? Is that sort of talk appropriate, or does it kind of miss the mark?
Well, I can understand that some folks would look at the biblical tradition, for example, and a story like Jonah. Interestingly, today's reading for Mass happens to be from the book of Jonah. I thought that was incredibly, just an incredible coincidence. So it's not hard to see how, the connection would be made. Historically, God has taken, these actions as a punishment to humankind. Obviously, the story of Noah is, one that leaps to mind. So I understand how those connections can be made. I think it's awfully difficult in any particular circumstance to say this is divine punishment. This is God somehow, telling people a clear message that I don't want you to do X, Y, or Z. I mean, usually what I observe is that the folks that are saying those things have, a pretty clear idea of what they think is wrong, therefore want to attribute it to God. So I myself would be very hesitant to make a snap judgment to say exactly what God is doing in any particular case. I think it's a lot safer to say, look, we know that God is the author of all creation, and so we want to say that God is there, but we don't want to say why God does what God does. That to me seems presumptuous.
Sure, and of course, kind of maybe the flip side of that same coin there is, how could a loving God allow something like this to happen? I think that's a question that people, with any kind of disaster, whether it be natural or man-made, I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, were asking that same question, say, after 9/11, but then, of course, after, these natural disasters as well. So how do we explore that question? How could a loving God allow something like this to happen?
Yeah, it's the perennial question. I guess for me, the major distinction is between actions that human beings do that are just cruel. So, you think of 9/11, you think of genocide, you think of the Holocaust, you think of people doing evil things, and that's one category, which is, certainly not something that we want to explain away, but we want to recognize that natural disasters are in an altogether different category. We don't want to blame anybody for something like a tsunami. We certainly can't say, that a person or a group of people has acted in an evil way. They take us by surprise, and I think for me they're all the more difficult to explain for that reason, and for that reason provoke the more, I think, the deeper kind of response of, how can God allow this to happen? And I don't want to say that there's an easy answer, but I guess I would want to affirm, that if we believe that God is God, then we can't say that there is an element of our experience as people where God is not. We can't sort of create a place where somehow God has, taken time off and allowed something to happen. So I think in a real way, we're saying that God is there. God is somehow present in those kinds of occurrences. Now, I mentioned, at your first question, that one place is that God is comforting people. And I suppose that, when I think of this in a more objective way, which is hard to do because it's so viscerally difficult, I feel for those people. But when I try to take a step back and think of this in a more objective way, I say to myself, this looks a lot to me the way that a parent interrupts child's activities or a child's activities and says essentially, look, there are other bigger things that are going on here. And certainly as Catholics, we can say we believe in a God who is Lord of life and death. Is death the final answer for us? Well, certainly the answer is no. It doesn't take away the suffering. It doesn't take away, the fact that there is real pain there. But if we take that, analogy of the parent interrupts activities and may in fact bring about suffering for the child. in a loving way, knowing what is ultimately good for that child. And I would see that there's something analogous going on there, that God is present in those activities, but present in a way that God only can be the one that knows how, there's going to be good that comes of this. That, to me, at least, begins to be the sliver of comfort that I see in an event like this.
All right. Well, Tim Muldoon, contributor to Pathos.com, we thank you so much. The article, God and Tsunamis, is available for anyone's viewing pleasure over at Pathos.com. Tim, thanks so much for taking some time out for us today. We appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. Coming up later on in the show, we'll hear some amazing stories of survival from Japan, one man's powerful story in particular. But first, Japanese bishops look at the road ahead for the Catholic Church in their country. That story and the rest of the day's headlines next. Welcome back to Currents. I'm Matt McClure. Coming up in just a bit, was it a miracle? A story of survival from Japan that you may not believe. But first, let's have a look at the day's headlines. Well, bishops in Japan are hard at work to help with relief following the magnitude 9.0 earthquake. They met today in Sendai, one of the hardest hit areas, and announced they're setting up an emergency center. The Vatican news agency Fides reports that the center will be managed by Caritas Japan. In other news from Sendai, a funeral mass was held today for a Canadian missionary priest and other victims killed in the quake. Well, meanwhile, Japanese Catholics in the U.S. and Canada are praying for loved ones back in their home country. Catholic News Service reporting a group of them gathered this past Sunday for Mass at St. Francis Xavier Chapel in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo neighborhood. Meanwhile, north of the border, the Toronto Japanese Catholic community also came together on Sunday. All the members of that community reported that their families were alive and safe. In other news, the situation for people trying to get out of Libya shows no signs of improvement. The Apostolic Vicar of Tripoli tells Fides news agency that a large number of refugees, many of them women and children, have been left stranded at the border. The Apostolic Vicar says more needs to be done to help them. The refugees are trying to escape ongoing unrest following calls for Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi to step down. From Pakistan now, a Christian man who was imprisoned on blasphemy charges has died. Authorities say 55-year-old Kamar David died of a heart attack, but the man's lawyer is disputing that. The lawyer says David was in good health and that it was not a natural death. Now, this comes 2 weeks after the assassination of Pakistan's Minister for Religious Minorities and more than 2 months after the death of a Pakistani governor. Both of those men were in favor of overturning Pakistan's blasphemy laws. Strong words, meanwhile, from a Scottish cardinal over a UK official's decision to double overseas aid to Pakistan. Cardinal Keith O'Brien, the head of the church in Scotland, says the UK's foreign secretary needs to demand religious freedom for Christians and other religious minorities. O'Brien says that increasing aid to Pakistan at a time when those calling for religious freedom are being killed there is, quote, tantamount to an anti-Christian foreign policy. Closer to home, it's another battle in the ongoing dispute over a proposed Islamic center near Ground Zero. Reuters reports that a firefighter who survived the terrorist attacks on September 11th is suing to overturn a decision to not declare the site a landmark. Last year, New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission denied landmark status to that building. The American Center for Law and Justice, which is representing the firefighter, told a court on Tuesday that the building should be a landmark because it was struck by landing gear from one of the hijacked planes used in the 9/11 attacks. Now, an attorney for the Landmarks Preservation Commission argued that the building is not a monument to the attacks and was not part of the World Trade Center. A judge said he would come to a decision within 4 weeks. An update now from Philadelphia, where Archbishop Cardinal Justin Regali met this week with priests to answer questions about the sex abuse scandal there. The Archdiocesan newspaper reports the cardinal met with diocesan and religious order priests at 3 meetings throughout the archdiocese. He answered questions that had previously been submitted by those priests. Now, last week, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia suspended 21 priests following a grand jury report on sexual abuse of children by clergy. Well, turning now to Washington, where the battle over federal funding of Planned Parenthood continues after the House voted yesterday to approve a short-term budget measure. 54 Republicans voted against the bill because it did not include the Pence amendment, which would stop federal funding of Planned Parenthood. House Speaker John Boehner says he's fighting to include the measure in a long-term budget bill. Meanwhile, from Spain, a priest in the Archdiocese of Barcelona who admits he paid for abortions is in the hot seat. In a new book, Father Manuel Posa admits to paying for abortions and says that he also blessed same-sex unions. So the Archdiocese of Barcelona announced that it was opening an investigation into whether his acts justify automatic excommunication. Now, in other news from Spain, close to 300,000 young people have signed up for this year's World Youth Day, which will take place in Madrid coming up in August. The Vatican says, though, it expects 1.5 million people to attend, and Rome Reports has more on a campaign happening around the event.
7 tons of prayer beads will arrive in Madrid in late April. The rosaries will be one of the gifts distributed in the souvenir packs World Youth Day pilgrims will receive. The 600,000 rosaries are being donated by Family Rosary Apostolate, an organization that promotes this devotion.
For
us, this donation is a means to highlight the importance of the rosary, to emphasize the importance of prayer.
The organization donates over 1 million rosaries each year worldwide. Father James Phelan emphasized that their manufacturing arm employs families with low incomes.
The rosaries are made in a factory in Quito. They aren't made in China. They are beads made in a Christian country, for Catholic families, in a city with many poor people, and in a factory that employs 150 families.
The Family Rosary Apostolate will launch a global campaign in May for World Youth Day to promote the praying of the Rosary every Saturday, the day that the Church dedicates to the Virgin Mary.
Stay tuned, there's much more currents ahead. Coming up, it's a contentious issue and a local parish weighs in.
It confirms what I thought before, that there's really an organized movement, by elitists who feel that certain people should not be born.
Welcome back. Well, the horrifying images from Japan these past few days are a chilling reminder of the scale of disaster nature can inflict on mankind. But man's inhumanity to our fellow man has also been well documented ever since Cain killed Abel. And one of the more horrific examples is, of course, the Holocaust, propped by the Nazi regime and a movement known as eugenics. It was a time when being judged as inferior was an automatic death sentence. Now, eugenics is the practice of improving the genetic composition of a population by exterminating its undesirable people. And it's widely believed to be the thing of a less enlightened past. But it is what some say is actually currently behind the high number of abortions in the African American community. The parishioners of St. Thomas More Church met Monday to view Maafa 21. It's a documentary that connects eugenics to abortion in the Black community. And our cameras were there.
This evening we have a documentary film called Maafa 21. Maafa means, in Swahili, it means tragedy or great disaster. It's a movie, though, that purports to trace the dots, or connect the dots, if you will, between eugenics, racism, and legalized abortion.
We believe that every human person is made in the image and likeness of God.
We're happy to have Ed McMahon, who works at the Archdiocese, providing some commentary on Maafa 21.
Every one of us, Elaine, all of the supposedly feeble-minded people that they showed in those videos, every single human person is made in the image and likeness of God. Once we move off of that standard, then we're into the utilitarian approach of usefulness and perceived value. The documentary is essentially a survey of the history of population control efforts to limit the Black population here in the United States. And it goes way back into the slavery era and to the post-slavery times, and then through the eugenics periods when there were people speaking openly about trying to limit the Black population. And it brings us up into the present day, when people don't like to speak quite so openly about eugenics, but they still talk about limiting population.
When slavery ended and Africans could no longer be financially exploited, many of those same corporations began pouring millions into the eugenics movement. The people they had found so valuable as property they had little use for as fellow citizens.
The number of African American babies who are being killed in the abortion clinics is just shattering. 60% of African American babies in New York City are being killed by abortion. So this is something that they need to face, and we're speaking to them and trying to help them to understand what this is doing to their community. And once they understand it, they're not going to need the rest of the pro-life movement to tell them what to do. They are smart enough and organized enough and capable enough to understand that they've got to change the culture in the inner city, they've got to change the culture among themselves, and eventually bring about some kind of political change.
I'm very concerned about this whole problem of abortion, and as an African American, how we as African Americans are affected by it.
It confirms what I thought before, that there's really an organized movement, by elitists who feel that certain people should not be born.
If there was economic equality and justice, I don't think blacks would have such a very high rate of abortion.
The battle to defend human life is fought one person at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, and one church at a time. And the elites and the powerful people may have their positions, but I'm actually very optimistic that in the end the truth will conquer. And the truth will conquer by the conversion of individual hearts, through our families, through our churches, and through our communities.
Well, stay tuned. There's much more Currents coming up. When we return, survivors of Japan's earthquake and tsunami tell their amazing stories. Finally tonight, the numbers coming out of Japan in the aftermath of the twin catastrophes of the earthquake and tsunami continue to astound. According to the latest figures, over 4,000 people are confirmed dead. Another 9,000 remain unaccounted for. There are other kinds of numbers, though, coming out of that country, the kinds of numbers that you hope continue to grow exponentially. The number of donations, the number of reunited families, and the number of survivors. Tonight we have the story of one such survivor. He was trapped in his car during the tsunami and thought his life was over, only to learn that he would be given a second chance to live. CNN's chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, had a chance to meet him.
The images are tough to watch, but as I learned, the stories are even harder to hear. You see those cars being tossed around like toys? Well, this man, Iyabashi, was in one of them, and he lived to tell about it.
So you were looking out your windshield and you saw the water coming?
He tried to escape, but it was too late. Over and over I was hit, he said, and then his car flooded. Mr. Iyabashi doesn't know how he was saved. The next thing he remembered was pulling up in the ambulance to Saka Hospital.
As you might imagine, triage is a big deal at a place like this. Here at Saka Hospital, they basically categorize patients into 4 categories immediately. Green, if it was a relatively minor injury, yellow if it was more serious, red if it was very serious, and black if the patient had died. When Mr. Iyabashi came in, he was considered a red.
Critically injured, his life was now in the hands of Dr. Takanori Sasaki.
So it's important to point out Dr. Sasaki's been here since Friday. He never left the hospital since the earthquake occurred, has been taking care of these patients as head of the emergency room.
Day after day, Saka Hospital stayed open, with Dr. Sasaki in charge, taking care of hundreds of patients. In Japan, near drownings and cardiac arrest are the most common serious injury seen, followed by head and crush injuries.
Now, Dr. Sasaki has been here since Friday, and I want to give you an idea of just how busy the busiest hospital has been after the earthquake and tsunami. 600 patients seen here over the last several days. 79 patients remain. 13 patients have died.
Watching Iyabashi closely, it is clear he is haunted by what happened to him. The tsunami robbed him of just about everything. In fact, you're looking at all he has left. But then, a rare smile, and he tells me, almost in disbelief, I am still alive.
Just an absolutely amazing, amazing story, and you see there all he had left right there on the table, but he was still able to muster a smile. It's amazing. It kind of, refocuses you on exactly what is important in life, and, well, life is certainly right up there. Well, that is it for tonight's show. Now, coming up tomorrow, do you know Pat? St. Patrick, that is. Yeah, it's just about that time of year again. We take our cameras to New York's highly anticipated St. Patrick's Day Parade. Until then, though, be sure to check us out online over at currentsny.net. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter. Now, coming up later tonight here on NET, it's believed to be a piece of the true cross. And for only the fourth time since it was rediscovered, it's been removed from its protective covering. Well, tonight at 9, watch as it is examined and filmed up close on the quest for the true cross. That is coming up tonight at 9 here on NET. Well, for all of us here at Currents, I'm Matt McClure. Thanks so much for watching tonight's Currents. Have a great night.